Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, Campers, Veterans, Tramps, and More, tracking the hidden origins of a national outdoor pastime in the 19th century, featuring Phoebe Young. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History here at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. With me this evening is AAS Programs Coordinator, Amanda Kondik. Tonight's guest is Phoebe Young, who in a few moments will share a presentation based on her latest book, Camping Grounds: Public Nature in American Life, from the Civil War to the Occupy Movement, published by Oxford University Press. For those interested in purchasing their own copy of the book, the publishers have provided us with a 30% discount code for the title, which will be provided shortly in the chat. We have some newcomers here this evening, so I want to say a few words of introduction to the American Antiquarian Society, a national research library and learned society in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share the materials printed and produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the world to use our reading room, as well as our digitized materials, to work on their own research projects. In addition, we offer regular programming like this one, and I invite you to join us for upcoming programs in the weeks to come. Tonight's program is part of a series on nature and the environment. You can go to our website to explore upcoming programs on other series, including women's history, artists in the archive, perspectives from our collections, and the history of the book. For those using this platform for the first time, my colleague Amanda will share guidelines on the technical functions of Zoom in the chat. To open the chat, click the chat box icon located at the bottom of your Zoom window. As a reminder to all, the program is being recorded, and it will be made available on the AAS website and YouTube channel in the weeks to come. Finally, we thank you for joining us this evening. And as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. And now on to our program. Phoebe S.K. Young is Associate Professor of History at the University of Colorado, Boulder, where she focuses on U.S. cultural and environmental history. Her most recent book, Camping Grounds: Public Nature in American Life from the Civil War to the Occupy Movement, the subject of tonight's talk, traces the hidden history of camping and the outdoors that connects a familiar recreational pastime to camps for functional needs and political purposes. She's the author of California Vieja, Culture and Memory in a Modern American Place, published by the University of California Press in 2006, and co-editor of Rendering Nature: Animals, Bodies, Places, Politics. She's received fellowships from the Henry E. Huntington Library, the Smithsonian Institution, and the American Council of Learned Societies, as well as the CU Boulder Faculty Assembly Award for distinction in teaching and pedagogy. With that, I give you Phoebe Young.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I am so pleased to be here and want to thank you and Amanda and the whole American Antiquarian Society. As always, I wish we were in person as we dig into these issues, but want to extend a welcome to everyone, no matter your time zone. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm truly honored and eager for this opportunity to talk to you about my new book and about a part of it that I don't get asked about as much as some of the others. So with that, I'll dive right in. So the origins of camping as a popular outdoor pastime. I could give you a kind of standard story that many of you probably already know of the United States becoming an industrial, urban, and consumer society in the late 19th century, right? Where between 1860 and 1920, the nation goes from being a majority rural population to a majority urban one. Is it any wonder, in that sense, that Americans sought relief by trying to get back to nature and the great outdoors? Sort of looks like the 19th century version of this, right? A fantasy of comfortable solitude in a beautiful setting. But in that case, there wouldn't be much to tell if this is a strict parallel between the late 19th and the early 21st centuries, because it looks the same. Are we really doing the same things? My research seeks to interrupt this seemingly simple connection, because camping is one of those things that just seems universal. It fits so squarely into our understanding of what Americans do, how we get back to nature, why we expect the federal government to provide us with a driveway, a picnic table, a fire ring, and these days, a hot shower and maybe free Wi-Fi for $25 a night in some gorgeous spot in the great outdoors. It seems perfectly natural. But instead, it is the result of a particular and somewhat surprising set of historical developments and cultural efforts that span more than a century. A couple of snapshots here from today's complicated outdoor landscape, right? We see camping as not just outdoor recreation, but something that became an essential activity, especially during those early days of the pandemic. And even before that, rendered into a kind of biological need, right? That we must get outdoors. But it has also become both functional living of last resort and a hotly debated issue at that in cities across the country, as well as a mechanism of political protest, whether for actual living purposes or, in this case, a signboard. So how do we get these multiple forms of camping, this complex landscape? And it's kind of tempting, right, to see that framing of recreational camping, those iconic images of the beautiful tent in the outdoor spot, right, as the essential form. And these other ones are somehow perversions of that. But the history is, frankly, more complicated and more interesting, because we can see these types emerging much earlier. The hobo jungle in 1895, Coxey's Army, a protest of the unemployed, which camped across the country and descended on the first march on Washington in 1893. Or some of the first recreational publications starting in the 1880s, promoting camping and other forms of outdoor leisure. But even this is a bit misleading, because looking at the 19th century suggests that, in fact, these categories that I have delineated, right, of recreational, functional, and political, were in fact much more fluid and not get clearly differentiated, even when these images were taken. As one scholar has noted, in the late 19th century, for the country's poorest working people especially, America was a vast archipelago of camps, entire encampments of people on the move, railroad camps, mining camps, logging camps, army camps, convict labor camps, African-American revival meetings, fairs, and the list goes on. And for many, living in camps was not that remarkable. It's what you did when you found yourself between lodgings, when it was needed for labor, and you might like it or not like it, but it didn't have a huge amount of cultural or symbolic meaning unto itself. And so the question for tonight is, how do we go from camps to camping? How does it become an activity that is an end in itself rather than the means to something else? So today, what I'd like to do is trace kind of three threads that roughly lead towards each of these categories, but which also expose their hidden, intertwined origins. And we're going to start with the Civil War. which was, among many other things, an instance of mass public camping. Not the first in US history, right? Just a couple of decades before this, 300,000 took to the Overland Trail, maybe the same number in the Gold Rush, right? And we have lots of documentation of folks' experiences in their diaries and letters, which the same holds true for the Civil War, where nearly 4 million men out of a population of about 30 million, and approximately 15% of the northern population camped out as part of the military. But even those eye-popping numbers are less significant for the fact that people camped out, and much more so because of the meaning that they made of it afterwards. And it's the Union soldiers here, we'll just call out, that are interesting. Because when soldiers returned, they had a shared experience of camping and access to a rapidly expanding mass press and a heightened political role to disseminate their memories and imbue them with meaning. Confederates, of course, slept outside just as much, but at least initially had less access to these claims of ideal citizens as Union veterans did, or to the sort of national media and politics. But what we see from these Union veterans is a kind of reworking of those wartime camp experiences in print venues, allowing meaning to emerge from what was, in most cases, an involuntary and regimented endeavor, if not outright drudgery, laced with impending doom. And despite this, camping became a popular method for reunion in the post-war era, a wholly voluntary practice that fostered veteran identity, fraternal order, national belonging, and political power. In the process, camp became something quite different. Romanticized, sure, but not simple nostalgia. Union veterans organizations and public remembrance employed certain aspects of camp life as a way of making sense of the war, both obscuring past unpleasantries and engaging in debate about present-day issues. In this sense, camping was crucial to the creation of the identity of the veteran as the emblematic US citizen in the wake of the Civil War. The Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, the largest Union veterans organization, planned reunions not just as nostalgic affairs, but as political performances to lobby for federal veterans' pensions and the greater social debt the government and the public owed the men who, in their words, saved the Union. That the GAR titled its reunions Encampments and frequently included tents and group camps in urban parks mattered, because it was from camp that they reminded the public that they were the boys who won the war, not aging men looking for a handout. The GAR most memorably fused this camping with a sense of patriotism and a vision of veterans as ideal citizens at their 1892 national encampment in Washington, D.C., which you see pictured here on the bottom left, where the image of white peaked tents in the shadow of the recently completed Washington Monument made a powerful visual connection between camping and the nation. But the national encampments rotated through cities across the country. And you see an image here from the 1886 encampment in Minneapolis, which fused not just patriotism, but also a kind of post-war eagerness for national travel and commercial development. And so really putting the veterans and their camps in the center of a forward-looking sort of economic and political platform, not just a backward-looking kind of recollection of the war itself. And so the camp began to fuse these various threads of both wartime and veteran experience with the sort of post-war milieu. Now, it's important to note that Black veterans as well could and did join the GAR, which was a unique voice at the time in favor of racial inclusion during an era otherwise filled with white racial animus and tendencies towards reconciliation with former rebels, something the GAR wanted nothing to do with, at least initially. Now, it's a complex story that we don't have time to go terribly in depth to, where the GAR did eventually experience de facto segregation and found itself limited by relying on an image of brotherhood from a segregated war, which failed to provide kind of robust tools to mount broader social or political advocacy on behalf of African Americans. But still, the symbols of camp and camaraderie, which formed the ingredients of the GAR's construction of veteran identity, permitted a defense of racial equality fairly remarkable for its time and matched by few, if any other primarily white organizations during the era. But moreover, for African Americans, making camp during and after the war meant something even deeper. It had become both method and symbol of freedom, though that did not come without risk. Enslaved people had begun to trickle and then flood into Union Army camps as early as the summer of 1861, fleeing their bondage and forcing the US military and Congress to confront the reality of Black freedom. Enslaved people in large numbers took to the woods and waterways ahead of armed pursuit, or walked away from plantations abandoned by fleeing planters until they could reach Union lines. Nearly 500,000, close to a tenth of enslaved people, forged this path of self-emancipation that ran directly through Union camps and posts. Accommodating the growing numbers posed a logistical problem for the US Army, and these refugees, labeled contraband of war in a creative legal strategy, suffered many challenges, from public health to continuing discrimination. But fleeing to Union camps offered at least the possibility of achieving freedom, rather than waiting to see whether freedom might eventually reach them. These Black actions made contraband camps important sites for negotiating the permanence and definition of that freedom. Thousands enlisted as soldiers out of the camps or contributed information and labor towards the war effort. In the process, they established expectations about the exchange of service for protection and citizenship, akin to the argument Union veterans would make after the war in lobbying for federal pensions. Refugees thus transformed contraband camps, for all of their hardships, into major cultural and political meeting grounds, discussing amongst themselves, as well as with Northern volunteers, what the content of their citizenship might look like after the war was over. And after the victory, freed people took to the roads and lived outdoors, in part to exercise the freedom that victory had granted. As Booker T. Washington remembered, traveling was a kind of test that made freedom real in the minds of some formerly enslaved people. To travel, he said, for at least a few days or weeks in order that they might feel really sure that they were free. In certain ways, freedom meant the ability to move without pass or permission, to reunite families, to seek jobs and community in cities, to return home after wartime displacement or forcible relocation, to live truly on their own, even if that meant outdoors. Now, it's important to mention that this was constrained, and freed people's ability to move was one of the first things former Confederates sought to try to restrict in the aftermath of the war. But here we see how camping has come to have political meaning, whether in the GAR pension advocacy or negotiations by freed people around the meanings of freedom. And making camp was becoming a method of making certain claims on public life, inhabiting public space in a way that connected the nation and the outdoors. And at this moment, it's also important to note that veterans were key in sparking interest in recreational camping as well, although in slightly different lines than our kind of stereotypical get back to nature images suggest. One Union veteran, this fellow named John Mead Gould, illuminates the ways in which camping and veteran identity intertwined in recreational ways after the war. Gould was a bank teller from Portland, Maine, and he served in 3 different Union Army regiments between April 1861 and March 1866, engaging in multiple battles and rising to the rank of major. after which he returned to Portland and his job at a bank, where he would work for the rest of his life. But his primary identity was as a veteran and as a camper. He camped many times with his family, with other friends, helped to establish the White Mountain Club, a precursor to the Appalachian Mountain Club, and joined the GAR, as well as the outpouring of veterans' narratives that appeared in print after the war, publishing the definitive regimental history of his units, the Maine 1st, 10th, 29th. But he also authored this 1877 guidebook, How to Camp Out, Hints for Camping and Walking. And while it clearly modeled itself on the military or veterans camping experiences, right? This is the image, the illustration in the book that he uses as kind of the proper attire for hiking, or as he in fact called it, marching to your campsite, as well as reproducing an image of how to put up the soldier's dog tent, which was hated during the war, but now becomes the major shelter for recreational campers, according to Gould, as well as in this kind of reminiscent cooking technique, right? So it's clearly modeling itself on his experiences in the military, but the guidebook was not intended for soldiers or veterans. To Gould's mind, they already knew how to camp. Rather, he hoped to pass along the knowledge and meaning of camp gleaned, hard-won from those experiences in war, as well as his pleasanter days exploring the mountains and woods and coastlines of Maine, to bring this to a new generation, to help them both appreciate what their elders, those men who saved the Union, had done, as well as to kind of learn a set of social instructions about how to emulate those experiences, to improve and enjoy themselves outdoors, to find personal reward and camaraderie. How to camp out, in that sense, is not so much about appreciating nature, about getting yourself into the wilderness for wilderness' sake, but about who you went with, who your comrades were, and how to understand what that meant in the larger scheme of the nation. And that sort of early beginnings of this kind of recreational attachment of getting out camping for those reasons also carries over into this second theme that I want to talk about, which revolves around John Muir, right? Of course, how can we talk about camping in the 19th century without talking about John Muir, who offers his quintessential vision of the kind of aesthetic appreciation of wilderness? The opening lines of the best-selling book he would publish in his lifetime, Our National Parks, in 1901, included what would become one of his most enduringly popular expressions, which you can still find on posters and mugs, and basically any Google search you put in about Muir. Going to the mountains is going home. Reflecting on what had come sort of the previous decades, right, from 1901, the famed naturalist began by applauding signs that Americans had taken that sentiment to heart. He said the tendency nowadays to wander in the wilderness is delightful to see. Thousands of nerve-shaken, over-civilized people are beginning to find out that going to the mountains is going home. Okay, so you've probably heard those words before, and maybe you're asking yourself at this point, what's hidden about John Muir, right? He's a pretty famous fellow. But the question for us is really, how did he arrive at this formula? We tend to think of Muir as this oddball genius ahead of his time, but what I want to do is follow his course a little bit before he became the John Muir that we all know. And here he is in about 1870, before he's become famous. Now, Muir is not a Civil War veteran. He was a draft evader, actually. And in 1867, after coming back from Canada in the aftermath of the Civil War, a talented, if somewhat unknown manager of a wagon wheel factory in Indianapolis, Muir decides to take off on a 1,000-mile walk through the South, from Kentucky to Georgia to Florida, to see what he called the American tropics. Okay, so there's the oddball part. But Muir wasn't alone out there. The trails of mid-19th century America were crowded with travelers, peddlers, surveyors, naturalists, migrants, laborers, soldiers, all of whom slept outside as part of a broad range of travel options, a means to an end, what you did when places where indoor beds were scarce. And Muir's choices initially reflected this general mindset. He went to some lengths to avoid camping out, even when in search of nature. And as of his 50 nights on the road in this trip in 1867, he spent about half lodging in private houses, mostly with strangers, with the remainder split between sleeping outdoors and what he worried about as slightly dodgy taverns or public houses. Typically, he would look for an amenable house or person to approach for a seemingly standard rural exchange, 25 cents for supper and a place to sleep, usually the floor or the barn. This could take some smooth talking among Southerners suspicious of wandering Yankees. And Muir's usual shtick was that he was traveling as a poor botanist, as he represents himself in this image on the bottom left, right, to kind of convey his innocence or non-threatening nature. And all of these images I'll show here with Muir are his drawings from his journal of this trip. But really, he thought sleeping outside was a last resort. And while he admitted he could enjoy camping out, when finding himself alone outdoors at night, his feelings of hunger and lonesomeness intensified. He got cold and wet. He worried about being robbed. He disliked the sounds of strange insects and beasts, and his thirst once drove him to very nervously drink from slimy pools groped for in the grass with the fear of alligators before his eyes. And in this image, he draws the nightmare that he had later that evening of being devoured by the alligator. Moreover, Muir regarded with suspicion, if not fear, many people he encountered on their own long walks, particularly freed people, and sought ways to keep himself safely hidden, not just from those wild creatures, but from what he called wild runaway Negroes, even choosing here to sleep in Charleston's Bonaventure graveyard for a week when short on funds, hoping the ghosts would protect him from freed people and the authorities alike. They didn't actually protect him from mosquitoes, I will note, as it's likely that he contracted malaria there, a case that would bring a halt to his travels before much longer. But as he continued south near Gainesville, shortly before collapsing from malarial fever, he ran into a Black family camped in the open. Creeping up to their circle of firelight to, in his words, discover whether or not it was a camp of robber Negroes, he was startled at what he called a primitive domestic establishment. As he approached, they offered him water and hominy brought by an unnoticed child who, to Muir, quote, emerged from the muck as if the Lord had manufactured him like Adam, direct from the earth. He takes the offered food and water, but finds the scene repellent. Quote, it is certainly not quite in harmony with nature. Birds make nests, and nearly all beasts make some kind of bed for their young, but these Negroes allow their younglings to lie nestless and naked in the dirt. Now, the personal or economic factors, legal or extra-legal duress, or the political context of the post-war South, all of these seem to escape Muir's notice at this juncture, even as he linked mobile Black bodies with a kind of unnatural social danger. And he wasn't unique in that regard. But for our purposes, I want to call out his focus on nesting, especially in light of the shelter which he had built while encamped at the Bonaventure Cemetery a few days before, which he referenced several times as his nest. And he began to develop in his journal this idea of nest making as the process of creating domestic space in the outdoors, offering protection from the elements. His descriptions of the structure create a kind of equivalence. What he calls in the text his moss nest, or nest with a roof to keep the dew off, became, in this image, my Bonaventure home. Where the willing bodily exposure, the seeming refusal to nest, suggested to Muir a non-civilized relationship to nature, here Muir suggests that the attempt to make a home or a nest was in fact a civilized way for humans to be in nature, and this was the one he wanted to pursue. And it's what he found when he joined fellow health seekers heading to California after recovering from his bout with malaria. And it was here that he discovered this sense of ease with nature, an intimacy between humans and the outdoors. His letters and journals from those first years, 1868 and 69, later published, heavily revised as My First Summer in the Sierra, Muir rhapsodizes, develops his signature prose about immersing himself in the Sierra foothills, of stuffing wildflowers in his pillowcase, enjoying sleeping outside, finding a kind of domestic harmony in the outdoors, as this image of a kind of comfy, cozy camp suggests. He exulted in sleeping every night on an aromatic mattress of spruce boughs. He felt less exposed inside this natural house, this more enclosed, domestic-like nature. He said, protected in these hills, you cannot feel yourself out of doors. But again, here in the Sierra, he wasn't alone. Not only was he working as a shepherd with other agricultural workers who he, oh, by the way, condemned for not appreciating the beauty of the nature they worked in, he also encountered many indigenous inhabitants. And long before Muir was moved to call these mountains home, groups of Miwok, Mono, Paiute, Yokut, and other indigenous people had inhabited the region for centuries. Muir's interpretations of those he met, just like the family of freed people in Florida, played a key role in his developing definitions of both the comfortable home and pure wilderness. The indigenous people Muir encountered represented a small fraction of the original inhabitants, and those in the Yosemite region had largely been forced out 2 decades before, relocated to agricultural labor camps in the Central Valley called rancherias. Indigenous people resisted often by leaving, with some reestablishing communities in the Yosemite Valley and quietly adapting to the growing tourist industry. They were there when John Muir arrived in 1868, but also it's important to note that this interlude, when the valley was gaining fame for its natural splendor, was in fact less inhabited than it was before or would be afterwards. Indigenous structures had been razed or burned, and whites had erected just a few cabins and a modest hotel, allowing Muir and other visitors to see the region as largely empty before their arrival, an example of untouched nature, virgin wilderness without an impactful human history. Muir occasionally noted that Indians had probably, quote, roamed these woods for centuries, extending far beyond the time that Columbus touched our shores, but he saw few traces of their legacy. When he did encounter indigenous people, he tended to liken them to wildlife rather than human communities. And while he sometimes praised them for being less destructive to the landscape, as the whites he excoriated for blasting rock, damming streams, and stripping the hillsides, he did so only by likening them to spiders and birds and squirrels and tree stumps and wood rats. And Muir occasionally chastised himself for failing to make use of the biota, as locals might, but he never seriously pursued how to reap nourishment from the land. He said, strange we should feel so food poor in so rich a wilderness. The Indians put us to shame, so do the squirrels. Starchy roots and seeds and bark in abundance, yet the failure of the meal sack disturbs our bodily balance and threatens our best enjoyments. We should boil lupine leaves, clover, starchy petioles, and saxifrage rootstocks like the Indians, but he didn't do that. Muir was famous for heading out for a week with half a loaf of bread, a hunk of moldy cheese, some tea, and maybe a blanket. And he held to this aesthetic and ascetic approach as a more civilized path to appreciating nature than the interdependent relationships that he observed among Indian people. And in fact, their interdependence was what led him to question their ability to make a civilized home in nature. And his interpretations evidence his deep misunderstandings about native lifeways in the Sierra. He simultaneously recognized and rejected native people's ability to produce a diversified diet from the Sierra ecosystem, and he generally failed to appreciate the complex ways they were working the land. Such omissions led Muir to see Indian people as unnatural interlopers in a pure wilderness, rather than the careful managers and long-standing inhabitants of the place that they were. Instead, Muir advocated for aesthetic and recreational experiences in nature as a salve for mind, body, and spirit of those over-civilized fellow Americans. And it was this vision that took hold among a group of elite early adopters who began to see nature as a place of retreat and rejuvenation, those from the professional classes who had the leisure time to partake and wanting to show themselves as doing so. But they were not simply roughing it, right? Campers during this moment imagined themselves, like Muir, as creating little islands of civilization in the wilderness, making temporary homes, nests, if you will, where women could play cards in their parlor, where a city lawyer could become a camp cook, or that a companionate couple could make a home. They were attracted to the juxtaposition of wilderness with civilized scenes, and women and families were there right alongside, practicing the domestic arts of camping with men, all grounded in Muir's aesthetic vision, which had been just one of many possible interpretations Americans made of outdoor travels during these tumultuous years. And it was in part built upon the inability to acknowledge the complexity of those who took different paths. African Americans looking to exercise freedom or find work, Indigenous people working to sustain their own homes and lands, right? Muir's reading of this experience as both the most natural and the most civilized, right, affected clearly more than just his own outlook. His luminous praise for the Sierra Nevada and tireless advocacy on behalf of wilderness would inspire generations of nerve-shaken, over-civilized people to embrace that mantra that going to the mountains is going home. But it also enabled them to see nature as a kind of blank screen, a not interdependent relationship about showcasing their leisure. So here we see recreational camping, but is totally intertwined with the development and reaction to these other forms. And that continues in the last thread I want to briefly consider, which is in the post-Civil War era, that same industrial economy which supported the growth of leisure camping, transportation networks, more vacation time for professionals, an expanding periodical press, also were key in causing greater rates of itinerancy. The unpredictable boom-bust economy that led to periods of high unemployment, and one that required a mobile labor force, particularly in the West, where a willingness to remain on the move was key to the growing industrial economy, right? Mining, timbering, agriculture, railroads. Both increasing numbers of people who slept outside for functional reasons, tramps, hobos, and bindlestiffs, and social fears about them. Whether more people were on the move than previous generations is in fact difficult to discern, but what is clear is that many middle-class Americans became increasingly alarmed by what they called the Tramp Problem, unemployed men lacking permanent homes and oscillating between seeking work and living off some combination of begging, stealing, and charity. No single cause appeared to explain this group of marginalized men, though several theories arose, and none other than Alan Pinkerton, founder of the fearsome corporate police force, union-busting, skull-cracking Pinkerton detectives, advanced one in his 1878 book, Strikers, Communists, Tramps, and Detectives. He suggested that perhaps Civil War veterans who had somehow been corrupted by the lazy habits of camp life were now leading this tramp army. And while many Union veterans did have difficulties readjusting to post-war society, whether for physical, financial, or psychological reasons, the aftermath of the war could not have fostered this enduring tramp population with a prolonged panic about it. Rather, the volatile economy that accompanied the post-war acceleration of industrial capitalism was a major factor, and Pinkerton acknowledged as much as well, these unprecedented hard times. But he and others presumed that tramps came from the ranks of working class malcontents. They were villainized in the press, understood as pests or diseases to be eradicated, armies and menaces to be defeated. Their willingness to live without an established home, even if the nature of the work required it, caused great consternation. Press coverage sensationalized their outdoor jungles, their group encampments on the outskirts of cities and towns. And Pinkerton included both harrowing descriptions and these kinds of illustrations, as you see here on the bottom right, of what he characterized as the grotesque company of tramp communities, right? Nonchalantly cooking their supper, roasting foraged chicken, potatoes, and green corn, while the light of the moon fell across the camp, giving its inmates a weird witch-like experience. And that they were dozing in a stupid, sodden way that told of brutish instincts and experiences. Pinkerton spoke to public fears, but his portrait was kind of incomplete because these camps provided both inexpensive places to dwell and communities of mutual support. Not to romanticize these, but tramps share domestic activities and responsibilities in semi-cooperative settings. And if hardship and strife remained constants, they could still find some measure of comfort and pleasure in camp life. And as social investigators like John McCook interviewed and studied these tramps and published about them in popular national magazines, curiosity about folks like Roving Bill Aspinwall, a dedicated tramp, as well as a Union Army veteran, and his life, and exclaiming the beauty of living outside attracted many. As Aspinwall wrote, "I would rather sit close to this beautiful sheet of water and write than to be in the most luxurious room in the land," and recommended that many could benefit from this form of outdoor living. The social exposés brought Aspinwall and other tramp stories to the public and contained for some a kind of seductive glimpse of a free and unconventional life. And even Alan Pinkerton recognized the appeal of tramping as a form of escape. "No person," he said, "can ever get a taste of the genuine pleasure of the road and not feel in some reckless way that he would like to become some sort of tramp." And this takes off, and the sort of tramp becomes a metaphor in books like Lee Merriweather's A Tramp Trip or How to See Europe on 50 cents a day, and arguing that traveling as a tramp rather than a tourist could bring about authentic freedom. And that this was about, as campers took up, going in tramp style, which was entirely different than becoming a tramp oneself, right? Men like Merriweather could go tramping about Europe and mingling with vagrants in America in pursuit of a kind of liberatory experience without finding themselves judged as irresponsible and subject to surveillance, discrimination, or arrest. Campers take this up as well, feeling free to enjoy the novelties of tramp style. And despite the divided destinies, recreational campers and tramps alike could appreciate simple outdoor pleasures like nature's beauty, sociable gathering, a good meal, right? But they took notice, these campers, of the uncomfortable resemblance and thought to distance themselves and their camping practices from tramps. As one author in Outing magazine of this article said, his family always went well-heeled and inhabited a deluxe tent. And his and others' descriptions of careful preparation and abundant equipment drew an implicit contrast with tramps and their meager possessions. Camping at this era was rarely promoted for its affordability, but rather that it should be camping deluxe that costs considerable in order to make these campsites as comfortable homes and to distance oneself from the danger of being mistaken for camps. As one writer instructed, "Site your camp where the casual pedestrian will be least likely to discover it. The great American tramp prowleth the face of the earth during camping weather, and you do not wish to find him in your temporary home any more than you yourself wish to find your future place among his number." So leisure camping here is built on assumptions that it is fundamentally temporary, that it is not a way of living, but something from which you can return, and marginalized those for whom they were living outdoors for functional reasons for the long haul, something just a generation before was pretty ordinary. And so that's how we get to this, camping as a platform for leisure in nature, right? Where this sort of sense of outdoor recreation as a place to sort of rejuvenate oneself becomes very much ingrained in the 20th century, and where the federal government starts to develop and subsidize a mass public infrastructure, and the rest of the book tells that story. But I'm going to end here with just a taste of the why, of how I argue that we can understand this trajectory that links John Gould to John Muir, freed people and Indigenous folks, tramps, and tramp style. And I argue in the book that by exemplifying how we use and share the outdoors, that camping is a kind of bellwether for our social contract, the set of beliefs and structures that establish what citizens and the government owe to each other, and public nature, access to the land that is both material and symbolic grounds upon which we negotiate our belonging to the nation, that was baked into the founding of this country and continues to evolve. This anchors a sense of national belonging or exclusion, whether dispossessing people of land, distributing land to individuals, or preserving land from development. Public nature has served as the grounds upon which to negotiate the nation's social contract since John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, where we were supposed to mix our labor with the land in order to create property. Now we mix our leisure with the land, consuming the outdoors for personal well-being as a kind of private investment. And those who do so for functional or political reasons are kind of left outside of this frame, even as it remains a potent mode for Americans to stake claim to public ground and to shared futures. And with that, I will end, and I'll be very curious to hear your thoughts and comments and questions. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Phoebe. This is really a fantastic presentation. I appreciate you having you here. As a reminder, there's a note in the chat reminding viewers that the Q&A feature is open for questions, and you can submit a question there, or you can upvote questions that you'd like to see move up the queue. I'd love to kind of get things started as we await for questions, Phoebe, so I'm just going to kind of jump right in. Absolutely love this book, and I really appreciate you joining us today. I think the book, for me, challenges the way in which I've come to know and experience camping, and it really kind of questions, I think, what so many of us really take for granted. And I think it really tells a larger story about what camping is and what it means for so many different people across our history. I know a lot of histories on the outdoors typically begin with John Muir, so I was especially interested in hearing the earlier side of things with the Civil War and post-Civil War, and very interested in the GAR, which I'm actually kind of learning for the first time, more or less, from your book. You know, I think it really complicates and it really pushes against kind of those romantic notions of rugged individualism. And I think, you know, one of the themes throughout the book is the way in which, you know, it highlights nature as a space for community. And especially with the GAR, I'm thinking of specifically for rekindling past relationships, for reenacting past experiences, and of course, for those political motives. So my question is really about the GAR and these national encampments. I'm wondering if you could just describe what this large spectacle of national encampments were, what that really entailed, because you offer, you know, great descriptions of the veterans and how they participated in various events in the book. And then maybe more specifically, what individual accounts exist on those encampments or on those activities, and what their motives and experiences were there.
Wow, yeah, those are great questions. And the GAR, there have been a number of historians that have written about it. It's one of those organizations that is, if you start to look, you see it everywhere in the late 19th century, but often doesn't rise to the top level of our storytelling about that era, but was involved in so many things. And I think, you know, it had this organization of local posts where veterans could join, not based on their regiment, but based on where they were living at the time. And they would have what they called campfires. Now, both with that and with the national encampments, it didn't always include a kind of actual physical reenactment of lighting a fire or pitching a tent, but that they would use that as a kind of symbolic label for what they were doing, to gather around the campfire, to tell stories, to invite others of younger generation to listen to the stories. So it wasn't just a kind of closed fraternal order, but rather a public performance, right, about making sure that people didn't forget the sacrifice that veterans had made, and to sort of keep them at the forefront of both local and national politics, especially as the 19th century wore on. And so, I mean, the national encampments were these kind of, they were smaller state affairs, and sort of they're very much, caught up in the kind of hoopla of, fraternal order, lodge culture of the late 19th century. But the national encampments were highly planned annual affairs where posts would send delegates across the country on railroads that offered discounted rates, and included everything from very large business meetings to mock battles and other forms of reenactment, to other just kind of socializing, the ritual eating of hardtack and coffee, and sort of, having both those kind of personal kind of reconnections, as well as kind of much larger kind of public performances in a way. And they produced a voluminous amount of material. You can certainly read in both, letters from people who attended, but speeches that were given, compilations that were published by the GAR. Particularly the best source is in fact in the GAR's kind of a newspaper, the National Tribune, which is all digitized by the Library of Congress. And you can read page after page after page of preparation, planning, images, stories, reminiscences of all of these national encampments. It took up a lot of column inches during the era. So it's there's so much more to be done there. That I found myself fascinating in learning about it myself for the first time when I started doing the research for the book.
I love the fact as well that many of the participants, at least for the national encampment, you wrote, were actually staying at very nice hotels. So there wasn't, this, reenactment of the actual camping. They actually kind of opted to stay somewhere nice and in a nice warm bed.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Many of them did. And let me just say, and I see there's some questions coming in the Q&A, and someone corrected me about Bonaventure Cemetery. Absolutely, it is in Savannah. I misspoke, and it's not in Charleston. I just sort of slipped my mind there, but thank you for pointing that out. You're absolutely right. It's in Savannah.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I just want to jump right on in here and get to as many as I can.
Okay.
The first question really asks about how women and children performed and participated in camping.
Yeah, so in this early era, absolutely, women are and children are in these camps, kind of from the get-go of these early recreational adopters in the 1870s and 1880s, and scattered kind of even earlier. But the funny thing is that in the periodical press, the rhetoric is always about how now camping is comfortable enough that women can come, and that you see that same statement being made in the 1880s and in 1900 and in 1920, right? So that there's this kind of the consistent thing that men have to lead, but that women are sort of there the whole time. But in any case, it's really interesting. As I talk a lot about it in one of the chapters of the book that I didn't have too much time to get into today, but we see both women and men kind of auditioning, kind of modern gender and family roles. Women sort of trying out not wearing their corsets, not bringing their servants, right? What a servantless household looks like, companionate marriage, right? These kind of modern forms of family in the campsite. It doesn't necessarily translate into what we might call, first wave feminism back in the city, but that it certainly was a space for them to sort of think about, if this is a space to recreate little islands of civilization, the idea was, what might that new civilization look like? And so there's a lot of memoirs and sort of published stories by women about their experiences, most of which, and partly this is the result of being in outdoor recreation periodicals who write very highly of their experiences. You get a few that complain about how much work it is and they don't like doing it. But in any case, many of them, do appreciate, among other things, the freedom to move. And to not be reined in by the sort of social proprieties and strictures of society back home.
You mentioned periodicals in that response a little bit, and throughout the talk, you've mentioned the importance of the periodical press, and you've mentioned a number of publications in the 1870s and 1880s. I'm specifically thinking about How to Camp Out. Outing Magazine made an appearance. A Tramp Trip, which I know I'm going to be looking up later. Do you know who some of these publications were marketing in terms of a readership, and how print media such as these contributed to new interest in camping? So essentially, how did these books and periodicals sell nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of the way that they sold nature was sort of vicariously. Far more people read about camping than actually went camping. And so they were, in a way, a kind of adventure story. So, those people that might be reading Jack London a little bit later, right, are reading the same kinds of true life camping stories. Guidebooks certainly were marketed. I mean, Gould's didn't sell that well, but he was a little ahead of the curve. Later ones would go through many different printings and editions where the sort of guidebook of how to do that. And so you get, smaller mentions from big national magazines like Scribner's to then the development of a whole genre, right, or category. So not just outing, but town and country and country life and other ones that are really dedicated to kind of outdoor recreation.
We have a question here from Alicia Marino, who asks about the nouveau tramp style living. She asks, there's been a new movement to tramp style living that seems to have started to embrace the idea of traveling around the world for pennies on a day, now to van life. So we've seen this, with a lot of YouTubers and the like. Do you think that this resurgence of gentrified tramping displaces those who may not have had a choice, or creates more division between those who choose to tramp and those for whom there is no choice? Do you think that it has become another mechanism for hierarchical segregation?
That's a great question. And I think I can just say yes. You did all the heavy lifting of the interpretation there, Alicia. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see the way van life has become the new tramp style in a way, but that is very much invested in the same kinds of narratives of recreational camping today. About sort of getting away from, the sort of strictures of urban life and sort of being independent. That certainly has reflections on or differentiates themselves from those who are, unhoused, not by choice, right? And I think Jessica Bruder's book, Nomadland, even more so than the movie, does a really good job of kind of showcasing exactly that kind of divide.
Great. We have a question asking about maybe other sections in the book and how you connect camping with environmentalism and the conservation movement. And I might actually tack on a question to that, because you do mention another character that I've learned just a little bit about prior to your book, and that is Emilio Meineke, the plant pathologist who tries to save the sequoia. So if you could talk a little bit more about conservation and how that plays a role in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in the sort of just after the part that I finished with today, talk about kind of the, establishment of the national parks, right? And the federal government, beginning to set aside these spaces for recreation. And that was one of their kind of key reasons. It wasn't as much about what we might think of as, preserving land for biodiversity or something like that, but as a space for recreation. So that was part of it from the get-go. But in the 1920s, they were so advertised, and it was really the first wave of loving nature to death. And so Meineke, this plant pathologist, gets called in to see what's happening. The redwoods are getting trampled by campers in California. And he, basically out of that experience and sort of figuring out what's happening, devises the design for the loop campground. Basically every campground you've ever been, right? Loop A and, site 12 with the driveway, the picnic table and the fire ring comes from this kind of moment in the 1930s where, Meineke does this basically to segregate campers from the sort of really sensitive parts of nature. But along the way kind of creates this blueprint that the federal government can use, in fact, vastly expand the number of campsites available in national parks and forests. So it's a kind of a dynamic that gets established quite early of both trying to open up these spaces for recreation, but also protect them from campers and recreationists that carries through, obviously, I think, to the situation today. And later in the book, I do also have a chapter about kind of the sort of 1960s, 70s era of environmentalism and the growing popularity of backpacking and the kind of connection there. I trace that through an organization called NOLS, the National Outdoor Leadership School, which many of you have probably heard of, but it sort of takes on that question for a later moment.
Thank you. I'm going to try to combine a couple of questions here for the sake of time. Were there any regional differences within the US regarding how the public viewed camping in the late 19th century? And also attached to that, how do people with physical disabilities figure into the rise of the camping movement?
Yeah, those are both great questions and not ones that I take on a lot in the book, but are ripe for investigation. I think I didn't see a whole lot of regional differences in terms of how people sort of took up camping. You certainly see, right, Californians in the wake of the Sierra Club taking it up just as avidly as those heading to the Adirondacks, right, a couple decades earlier in the East Coast. So it's definitely a national phenomenon. Tramps sort of figure slightly differently in that sense, in because in the West, the sort of requirement of a mobile labor force, right, is that the sort of Western economy in the late 19th century is all about people who are willing to stay on the move and not establish a permanent place of residence. And they experience both, they're needed, and then as soon as they're not needed, they're sort of, run out of town. And so there are some spaces, maybe gateway towns we might think of, where that tension between recreational campers and tramps is higher, right, in those particular spaces. But otherwise, I at least didn't find any, major regional differences. And the question of disability, I mean, I think this is actually in the field of environmental history has been incredibly important in pushing all of us to rethink a lot of the categories about what outdoor recreation means. And it was certainly one of the things that the GAR was hoping to showcase was that whether, the veterans were amputees or not, that they were still the boys who won the war, and that sort of camp was a space for them to showcase their kind of, continuing vitality. And so, but there wasn't, at least in open discussion, a question of what to do with folks who were not fully able-bodied. Photographs do reveal a fair amount that there were certainly those, participants who were disabled. Who had various, kinds of sort of observable physical challenges. But it's not something that I, at least when I was working on this, was able to really get into. But it is something that has been a question on my mind as well, moving forward and thinking about outdoor recreation writ large. And there's been some really great studies and analysis about that have come out in recent years. So thank you for that question.
As always, I'm going to try to combine questions here, awkwardly as they may be, for the sake of time. You did at the very end of your talk mention John Locke, the social contract, of course, Thomas Jefferson and his idea of kind of the agrarian citizen as being the virtuous citizen. So we have these, early foundings ideas around how the outdoors and nature are connected to what it means to be an American. Was camping much more common in the US than other parts of the world? And forgive the awkwardness, how do Boy Scouts and Girl Scout camps figure into the story, especially when you consider these modes of youth education as an idea of character building? There's the connection. Okay,
very good. And I'm going to throw the question about revivals and camp meetings in there as well, because I think I can make them all fit. So right. I mean, there are multiple forms of camping, and I tend to talk about that with the minor exception of Knowles, which is a kind of, outdoor sort of organized camping, that mostly I look at what I call disorganized camping, sort of individuals. And I guess GAR is an exception to that as well. But obviously, right, revivals, camp meetings, later Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, right, are using the outdoors for a variety of purposes. And in some ways are a kind of means to an end, right? I was trying to look at ways in which camping was its own self. And one certainly, and there's been lots written about scouting in this way, about how outdoor experience and challenging oneself in nature, right, is character building. You see this with Outward Bound and other similar kinds of organizations, or with revivals, right, as an outlet or a platform for a spiritual experience, right, and religious conversion, and that's important to sort of get out of the sort of strictures of town in order to have that experience, but also house and kind of broadcast to so many people in this kind of mass experience. So I touch upon those quite, briefly in this sense, but mostly just to point out, right, that it helps actually us understand the ways in which camping, if once you start seeing all the different methods and purposes for camping, that it is neither universal nor particularly natural, but in fact, it's quite historical, right? That's a standard historian's caution that, warning, things that look natural are probably historical. And that is also the sort of context for the international comparison, right? Yes, absolutely. People in other countries slept outside for functional reasons, have recreational camping traditions. You see this in a number of European countries, France, Germany, the British Isles, that they certainly have those kinds of experiences. My sense from a very limited amount of comparative work that I've done is that the sort of US story, because of that kind of Jeffersonian investing your labor with the land and this deep connection with national identity and territorial expansion and a kind of Western sort of property, is that it takes on this kind of greater ability to serve as a bellwether for national belonging, exclusion, social contract, that, lots of people camp in France. I don't think it has as much to do with French national identity. Now, I haven't said I'm not a historian of France, so I'm happy to be contradicted on that state, but it's compared to me, at least for the US, I think of, I often get asked, do I like to camp? And the answer is yes, I do. I don't camp as much as I used to. But partly living here in Boulder, Colorado, where nature's right outside my door, I can come home to a hot shower. But it's in a way, it's still quite important more broadly in the ways that other forms of outdoor recreation, while important, say biking or skiing or climbing, right? They are kind of important to sort of look at on their own in terms of outdoor recreation. But I think they tell us a little bit less about this kind of broader question of nationality than camping, because it's so capacious, and you don't really see political skiing, right? Or you might see functional cycling, not so much functional climbing. So it's that kind of sort of broader spectrum of these different forms of camping that, for me, made it the story that I wanted to tell.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phoebe. With that, I think we have to conclude our program for tonight, but thank you so much, Phoebe, for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin, Amanda, and the AAS. I was just thrilled to be here. And I'll just say, for any of you that we didn't get to your question, you can find me at my CU Boulder History Department. I'd be happy to chat and answer questions or hear your thoughts offline.
Fantastic. Thank you for that offer. I always send all of the questions on to our guests as well, so they'll always have a set of those waiting for them. As a reminder, this talk will be published on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so please look out for that. We have a terrific set of programs ahead of us. Next Tuesday, May 10th, we welcome Crystal Lynn Webster and Cabria Baumgardner in conversation with Nazira Wright to discuss traumas and triumphs, a roundtable on the history of Black childhood. On Tuesday, May 17th at 7 p.m., we welcome folks back to Antiquarian Hall for a hybrid program featuring Robert Gross in conversation with our president, Scott Casper, around Gross's new book, The Transcendentalists and Their World. Our next virtual book talk, sponsored by the program and the history of the book in American culture, takes place on May 26th at 2 p.m. Join us to hear David K. Thompson discuss Bonds of War, how Civil War financial agents sold the world on the Union. All of this information is available on our website and on the chat. I thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a good evening, and I will see you next time.